So I figured it was about time for me to do a video on basically a very detailed version of the history of the 318. So what I'm going to do, this is mostly a voiceover. I will try to put a few videos and then some pictures in here as well as I go along, trying to pull out different information that I'm trying to get across. So the John Deere 318 was released in 1983. It was available as early as October, November of 1982, depending on the literature that you look at. And it was a replacement for more or less the John Deere 317. The 317 had had its own problems over the years, mostly due to the Series 1 Kohler that did not have a fully pressurized lubrication system or oil system. And it was it was known for basically not oiling itself on hills. And so basically, Deere took a pretty bad reputation hit on the 317. Not that, and they eventually figured out that problem, and they rectified it with the Series 2 Kohler KT17. But anyway, they redesigned the 317 into the 318. And from 1983, when it was introduced, to 1986, the 318 was powered by a B43G Onan engine, which was 43 cubic inches, producing 18 horsepower at a rated 3,450 RPM. Do note that the RPM that's spec'd by Onan is often 3,600, but Deere has set all their literature at 3,450. I think a couple important things to note here is Deere did keep the front mounting system that dated back to the original release of in 1968 of the 140. So this meant that all powered attachments from 1968 through more or less 1992 would work on the 318. Now, powered attachments compared to non-powered attachments require a little bit of conversion, but things like the blade and then also like a Thatcher or anything like that, those just fit right on. Meanwhile, things like the snowblower or snow thrower, they required some few modifications, mainly just kind of brackets to hold the chute rotation, things along those lines. And then also, if you use the 540 PTO, you need a different PTO pulley to line up the belt properly, which is really good. I mean, and Deere really is continuing that tradition today. Basically, any quick attach implement from 1992 still fits up to a 2021, possibly later, garden tractor. So aside from the engine from being different from the 317, there were two other, or what I would classify two other major changes in the 318 over the 317, the previous model. One of those is the differential. So while Deere kept the Sunstrand 15U pump, they did away with the Dana rear end, more or less that kind of ball-shaped rear end that you would historically see in the 140s, in the late 140s, all the way up to the 317s. And they converted it to a Peerless unit that was developed with Deere's input. And interestingly enough, Deere did maintain a 1-year exclusive deal on that differential through Peerless. And at that time, Peerless was a subsidiary of Tecumseh. The differential, as I've already mentioned, was coupled with the Sunstrand 15U pump, which had been in service since the mid model 140s. And the only notable changes on the 15U pump were the addition of the splined drive shaft as opposed to the spring pin and wire that had been there previously. So that is one difference in the 15U pump. The other major change from the 317 to the 318 is the open rear frame with the rock shaft. Now, prior to 1983, so 1982 all the way back to the 140, the frame in the rear of garden tractors was closed in. Basically, it was kind of a box. By having an open frame, it allowed a rock shaft to be installed, and it also allowed the installation of a Category 1 or Category 0 hitch that was permanently installed on the tractor. Prior to that, there was a 3-point that was available for the 140 and the 300 series, but it required a rear hydraulic outlet. And the 318 basically used the deck lift cylinder placed on the rear of the machine to move the rock shaft for the 3-point or the empty rock shaft for just the deck. So those are the two major differences, and we're going to get into or two major improvements from the 317 going into 318. And obviously there are a lot more, and we're going to get into those. But with the 318, obviously came a lot of attachments. And so I'm just going to briefly read down a list of attachments here. There were 4 different mower decks available for the 318 throughout its run. The first 2 original were a 46-inch deck and then a 50-inch, what we'll call a little higher capacity deck. And then later in the production, you had the 38-inch deck that was available. Not a very common deck because it barely covers the width of the tractor. And then later in life, the 48-inch replacement deck was available. Basically, it's just a replacement deck. It was modeled off the architecture of the decks in the 1990s instead of decks that were designed in the late 70s and early 80s. Front mount wise, there was a Model 49 snow thrower, so a single stage 46-inch wide snow thrower. There was the introduction in 1983 of the 47-inch 2-stage snow blower, what we would now refer to as the refrigerator style snow blowers. They're just so big. The 54 blade, you could either get a simple 2-way blade, so up, down only, or you could add the angle kit. And also one of the front attachments that we oftentimes forget about is the number 4 log splitter. Just the only problem with that is it's pretty slow, piles hours on machines, and at the same time, it's gigantic on the front. The rear mount, I'm going to break these down into rear mounts that require no 3-point and a rear mount attachments that require 3-point. Those not requiring any 3-point would be the 30 hydraulic tiller. The 30 hydraulic tiller had its own mounting brackets along with the tilt dump bagger and the hydraulic dump bagger. Those mounted straight onto the rear of the machine. Rear attachments with the 3-point included the Model 20 plow, and obviously there's any categories here a 3-point attachment would fit, but these are just directly from Deere. The Model 20 plow, and then the next 3 I'm going to talk about would require the 2000 RPM PTO. Now, previously, the PTO would have hooked into the rear of the Sunstrand 15U pump and just coupled right into that, and then there would have been a pulley in the back, and you would have controlled the PTO through some type of tension mechanism on the back of the 140 or the 317. Starting in 1983, there was actually a gearbox introduced. So the 2000, it basically turned 2000 RPM. And then that would require, that could run the 48-inch tiller, which mechanical tiller. It would also run the 50-inch and the 60-inch finish mower. Now, interesting on the 50 and the 60-inch finish mower, it was a Model 260 for the 60-inch finish mower. Both of those were discontinued in the late 80s due to lack of demand or lack of sales. So they did not carry on very late in the 318 production. There are also a couple of variations in the 30 tiller drive, and as well as the bagger drive units that I'm not going to get into in this video because it's fairly complicated, just to try to explain all the different variations. But basically, the biggest change from the previous series, so the 317 to the 318, was addition of that gearbox and the fact that it had electromechanical PTO that turned the gearbox on and off rather than just a tensioning mechanism. Some things we often forget about would be allied equipment. I'm just going to quickly go down this list of allied equipment. Probably one of the coolest things that was available from allied equipment was the LD6 Brantley backhoe. Now, keep in mind that in 1983, no, I guess it was 87 that I have a catalog from. In 1987, that Brantley backhoe was almost $3,400. I don't know what that would be in today's money. But if you want to do the inflation calculator, you can look it up. Obviously, all of the Brindley Hardy equipment would be available for the 318 Cozy Cab, Easy Rakes. The Haben 512A flail mower was available, York rakes, JRCO, scoops and scarifiers, and they actually had a pallet mover type deal. Mott flail mowers, PECO or Petco vacuums or lawn sweepers, Roxy Bonner reel mowers, sweepers, and then Woods mowers, interestingly enough, were available for the 2000 RPM PTO rear. So those are just some of the attachments. When the 318 came out, it came out obviously with a lot of fanfare. Everybody, or you may or may not have seen that really cool, I would call it three-dimensional cutaway that is in some of the original literature that was, or brochures that were released with the 318. Interestingly enough, the advertised features were one of the chief ones was parts commonality between the two Onan engines. Now, I haven't talked about the other Onan engine yet. The 420 came out at the same time as the 318, which had the B48G. So it was 48 cubic inches. And then the 318 had the B43G. There was a 95% parts commonality between the two of those. I thought it was an interesting thing to be in the sales literature. Obviously, they advertised the full pressure lubrication after their disaster with the 317. The hydraulic cooler was also advertised as part of the 318. It's basically located directly behind the flywheel of the engine. And then I think most importantly, in terms of operator use, was the advertisement of the agricultural type hydrostatic power steering. Now, interestingly enough, that's where we're actually going to start talking about the differences in the various models of the 318 all the way up through 1992. And I'm just going to these are by no means, this list that I'm about to go through is by no means a end all be all of changes. But this hydrostatic power steering actually caused some issues the first year or so in 1983. The 1983 model year of the 318 and the 420 for that matter, the hydrostatic power steering only had 4 ports. So this would cover serial numbers 222,001 all the way up to 285,000. The power steering valve was installed that led to a flow of the pressure leaving the pump, that pressure line going to the hydraulic auxiliary valve, so your H2 valve. And then from that H2 valve, it either went to the steering or went to the hydraulic circuits or returned back to the pump. Well, the interesting thing about that is when you moved the hydraulic circuits, you deprived the hydraulic flow to the steering cylinder because the flow preferentially went to the auxiliary valve. In 1984, so starting at serial number 285,001, Deere installed a 5-port column. This column basically preferentially put the flow onto the power steering pump or power steering valve. By doing that, so basically what happened is the pressure went from the pump to the steering valve, and then from the steering valve, it either had to go to the turns or then it went to the auxiliary hydraulic valve. So, as I mentioned, the reason this change was made was so the priority of the flow went to steering, because originally, and if you can go back, you can even look on the forums today, folks that own a 1983 John Deere sometimes will complain about the fact if they're moving snow or using front attachments, all of a sudden they lose their steering. That is because so much flow is going to the implements that it can't go to the steering valve, and you either have little or no steering. So the 5-port column prioritized that steering. Now, that's not to say that early issues with the 318, that wasn't the only issue. If you look through a lot of the service bulletins from 1983 all the way up through early 86 or late 85, depending on how you want to look at it, there were a ton of bulletins on carb and throttle adjustments and surging. In the end, in 1985, they actually released a kit that changed the idle progression hole sizes to allow richer mixtures to stop the surging. They also, I believe it was in mid-83, maybe it wasn't mid-83, but at some point they added the dash pot in there to make the governor less sensitive. Basically, the governor was a little too sensitive for the throttle, and it surged a little bit. And like I said, there were numerous service bulletins over the years. And really, after 1985, you don't see a lot of references to surging other than the occasional, suggestion to a dealer how to fix something in the service literature. Other kits that came out early was the brake grass proofing. If you've ever dealt with the 318 brakes, you know that they have a little opening in the back that you can adjust the brake tension. Originally, they had problems with water and grass getting in there and blocking the brakes. They put a kit on there. It was called grass proofing or a snow proofing kit. They also added a grease zerk to the end of the steering cylinder eye. Another other one of the early changes, I believe this was in '85. They quit drilling out the auxiliary holes in the fuel pump. If you've ever had a 318 with an original fuel pump, you know that you have the little plastic cap over it. Those plastic caps leaked, and so they quit drilling them out. And that's if you had an early 318. Also, some earlier problems they had was differential leakage, basically gaskets misaligning themselves. The oil pressure warning light very early in '83. Also, they had some starter mount issues, and they had some front axle deflector bolt wear. And then prior to unit 23 231,902, they had run the fuel lines a little different, and you ended up with some kinked fuel lines on these machines. So I mean, it was not without its trouble, but I can go ahead and tell you from my experience, the trouble experience with the 318 and the service bulletins was not near what I have read about the 317. Um, Other changes that I want to talk about, one of them is the hydrostatic controls. Hydrostatic controls are we'll just say, legendary pain sometimes when it comes to these machines creeping in neutral. There were four main versions of the hydrostatic control, and we're actually going to break those down into two versions. The first one was from the first serial number, so 222,001, all the way up to mid 1986 or 372,595. This was a turnbuckle type system with a non-adjustable handle. So the handle on the dash actually went down and made a little U shape, and on that U shape was very similar to what was on the 317. But you had the turnbuckle going back to the input swash plate on the 15U pump, and that turnbuckle is what adjusted the neutral. In mid 1988, so basically, from mid 1986 to mid 1988, there was a turnbuckle system. However, they went to an adjustable handle. So it's a handle that has a 3-bolt system that holds the handle in place. Those two systems we're going to classify as one type of system. Aside from the adjustable handle, they both used a turnbuckle to adjust. The last two versions, one ran through from mid 1988 all the way up to early 1991. And that meant and that's serial number 104,040. So remember, the serial numbers rolled over in there during that time. But basically, all the adjustment was done at the swash plate, or majority of the adjustment was done at the swash plate. All you had to do from the mid '88 models forward is you had to remove the side cover and you just change the bolt, or you tightened the bolts or loosen the bolts. But all the actual adjustments were done at the swash plate instead of putting your hand next to a drive shaft, which was kind of nice. And then the last version was 104,041 all the way up to 120,000, so the very end of production. And all that did was move the dampener on the whole system, so something that slows down the movement, from the dash area all the way to the rear frame. And that is the last iteration of the hydrostatic linkages. What's interesting about the later linkages is they seem to be easier to adjust. Now, with that, remember those serial numbers when we talk about frames later. But while we're on the subject of frames, I figured I would talk about a frame support change. Now, if you've watched a lot of my videos, you know that there is 300 and 400 series is prone to cracking. Now, unfortunately, I don't know where the serial number break is. If somebody does have a serial, if somebody knows of this serial number break from data, I would really like to know exactly what it is. Very early machines had there was a cross frame that supported the or the 15U Sunstrand pump. In early machines, that frame cross piece was bolted to the frame on both sides and bolted to the input or the charge pump or the transmission, whatever you want to call it, in two places. What they found is the differential was breaking in that particular case, and because it wasn't the frame did not have the ability to flex. So what they did is they added a shoulder bolt and they reduced one bolt that attached the differential to the frame. And so you can see that in these pictures, the difference between the two systems. Other changes that you might see and related to, I would say, propulsion. Um, there are differences in the brake springs, and I know that's a really random one, but I have had people tell me it's like, oh, this is uh, a farmer fix or something like that, because the early return spring actually went to the back of the frame, and so that was prior to serial number 367, 313, 367,313. The spring went from the brake control arm all the way back to the back of the frame. In early 1986, a washer started to be welded to that brake rod, and the spring was placed in a forward position to pull on the brakes to return it. And now that we're talking about 1986, I figured it would be a good point to show that in 1987, or at serial number 420,000, the B43G was replaced in favor of the P218G Onan. Now, the P218 increased the displacement from 48 cubic inches or from 43 cubic inches to 48 cubic inches, still producing 18 horsepower at 3,450 RPM. Now, this was accomplished through a smaller venturi in the carburetor, so a small air opening in the carburetor, and the camshaft was not nearly as tall, so the valves didn't open as far when it came to um, the intake and exhaust stroke. Now, the big change with the P218G, aside from the displacement, was the addition of the electronic ignition. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, why on earth did they move away from a coil type of ignition with the condenser and points to an electronic ignition? It still had a coil. The electronic ignition has a pickup behind the flywheel, so they had to substantially modify the flywheel. They modified the drive shaft length, etc. There's a couple different things that went on there. But really, and this is my opinion, I do not have any data showing any of this. But in the late 80s, I think it was getting to the point where you started to see some consumer culture come in and there was less of a desire to work on things. Well, we all know that points do require some maintenance from time to time. And that maintenance, I think, led to the addition of the electronic ignition system, basically a pickup on the flywheel and all based on magnets. And you, at that point, you don't really have to worry about um, maintaining points. Now, obviously, there's some increased cost to the system, et cetera, that have to be added in there. And obviously, points are a whole lot easier to replace than getting behind the flywheel to replace electronic ignition. But it's been a pretty robust system. And I think if I had my choice, I would probably pick the electronic one. So that was a big change. Now, at the same time, now that we're talking about engines, I think it's important to talk about starters because the starters lead to some pretty interesting things with the frames. So originally, and this is where I actually need some more information because not a lot of it is detailed in part breakdowns that I have. The early machine came with Bendix style starters, so the B43G engines, and basically 222,001 all the way up through 264,137 had Bendix style starters. At 364,138, they went to the solenoid shift starter. Now that means that the solenoid shift starter, the Bendix style starter had the solenoid under the dash pedestal. Meanwhile, the solenoid shift starter had the solenoid on the starter. It's that pain to replace starter. They also moved the starter mounting locations. The Bendix starter was on the oil pan, while the solenoid shift starter hung on the underside of the block. Now, what's really interesting about that, and this is where I would appreciate input, there's a discrepancy in the starters. The solenoid shift starters from 364,137, which would be, let's see here, mid 86, early 86. So from early 86, they installed the solenoid shift starters. What's interesting about that is I think those starters were still attached to the oil pan instead of attached to the block, because I have never seen a B series block that had the starter bosses on it. But I have seen a B series Onan with a solenoid shift style starter on it. In fact, the B43G that I rebuilt with a friend many years ago now, that's the B43G rebuilt on my channel, that had a solenoid shift style starter that was bolted to the oil pan. So it's very confusing when it comes to serial number breaks there and exactly what was going on. And what further muddies the waters, I think, is the fact that there are 5 different frame part numbers. And we can chase those frame parts to the hydrostatic control linkage changes only. So originally, the first frame was from 1983, 1986, and it stopped. The first frame part number, the serial number break, is 372,595. And if you remember that, that is the original frame, that is the original hydrostatic mechanism. And then starting in mid 1986, then you roll over into the second frame. So 372,596, all the way up to 485,761. That was one frame type. Like I said, once again, those are hydrostatic control mechanism breaks. And then frames 3 through 5, so we're going to call them number 3, 4, and 5. They actually all sub to the last frame number, so that just there's minor breaks in there for various control mechanisms. However, the last frame break, the last part number is 104,041 all the way into the production. And that's where they added that dampener in the back of the machine and they moved it out of the front. So it tells you that there was a lot of continuity between those last 3 groups. But what's interesting about all of that is going back to the starters is on the solenoid shift starter, you have to have a hole cut out in the frame for the starter to go through. Prior to the addition of the solenoid shift starter, the engine mounting pan or base was a solid piece of metal. Now, I've actually cut out a number of frames to install solenoid shift starters in these engines or on these frames, putting new engines in the frames. So it's not uncommon to do that. But what's really interesting is there's no frame break or no frame serial number break to tell us when the solenoid shift starter was added, unless they just made a change to the part number, because at that time it was super easy just to punch a hole in the frame or in the base, the engine base, and just keep on trucking and call it the same part number, which is a unique circumstance, but it can happen. So just an interesting point to think about there. And if you have any concrete information on any of that, I'm all ears to listen for it. Other known changes, since we're getting close to 30 minutes here, other known changes is in 1987, in the Sunstrand 15U pump, the control plates and the needle bearings were replaced with bronze bushing, and the control plates were changed, and that was to quiet the pumps down a little bit. And that change initially started with the 322 and it was released to all the machines in late 1987. I don't have a specific serial number break there. Flip up seat was added in 1988, which seems pretty much a no brainer to me. Along with the hydrostatic control mechanism that was added in mid 1988, they had the pedestal side screen, the removable side screen. And then in mid 1986, they went from 1-inch front spindles, so the spindles the front wheels were on, to 25 millimeter. So that was changed. That change was made at serial number 372,595. So that's kind of a brief history of the 318. I think I think we hit all the good high points there. If you're interested in a lot of the history of the 318, I think the 318 was improved throughout its production run, and in 1992 when they ceased production, I think it was about the best it could be. Looking at some of the late examples that I have compared to the early examples, I would say that the machine was made better over time. However, in 1992, by this time, I mean, you're looking at the Sunstrand 15U pump had been in machines since Deere garden tractors since the early 70s. Um, the There were better things out there, and that's what led Deere to move to other units. Now, interestingly, in my opinion, there is no direct successor to the 318. I think the closest thing you can come to is the 425, but you add a little bit of weight, you add differential lock, you add horsepower, and so you've got some differences there. But I think that the 425 probably best fits the bill when it comes to a replacement for a 318, but by no means is it direct. So hopefully that was educational. If you have some thoughts, obviously there's no way you could get all the changes and stuff. But if you see something, or if I missed something, let me know in the comments below, and it'd be a good discussion. So thanks for watching.